Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks news, as the Sharks have announced that they have signed forward Jeff Skinner to a one-year deal worth $3 million. The actual financials of this contract aren't particularly important. The $3 million will be useful in being able to stay above the salary cap floor, but since it is just 1 year, it's not going to impact any future dealings that the Sharks might have. Instead, this is pretty much a short-term band-aid solution to the Sharks' major problem of this past season, or one of them, which is the fact that they struggled to score goals. They were the lowest scoring team in the entire NHL. We knew that they were in the market to try and pick up another top 9 forward, and Jeff Skinner definitely fits that description. He had 16 goals this past season with the Edmonton Oilers in 72 games. You do have to be a little bit careful when it comes to Edmonton Oilers wingers, because at times they will find themselves in a position on the top line playing with McDavid or Draisaitl, and that will heavily inflate their offensive totals, and occasionally Skinner did find themselves in those spots, but he usually spent most of his time in the Oilers' bottom 6, and if you go back in his career, he has proven himself to be a relatively consistent 20 to 30 goal scorer. I suspect he'll be able to put up similar numbers with the Sharks this next season, especially when you also consider the fact that this past year with the Oilers, he had just 13 minutes of average time on ice. That should be a good couple of minutes higher here with the Sharks, since they have a bit less depth than Edmonton does. Now, the ultimate question now becomes, where does Jeff Skinner actually fit in to this forward group? I made a video a few days ago discussing a very early look at what the Sharks forward lines could end up being come the beginning of the next season, and obviously Jeff Skinner will find himself within this top 12 and definitely within this top 9 even, and so the easy and obvious substitution from what I had was to have him replace Igor Chernyshov on this third line, have him play with Alex Wennberg and Adam Gaudette. But there are two major problems with that decision. The first of which is that Skinner is a very one-dimensional player. He brings a good amount of offense to the table, but really not much else, and usually you might want more of a two-way type of player like Wennberg and Gaudette are in this particular position. But the other problem with this is that with Jeff Skinner being on an expiring contract, being more of a veteran player, a lot of people are theorizing that he is a player who's going to end up just getting flipped at this next year's deadline. But the issue with that is that Skinner doesn't quite have the build to be a player who will find success in the postseason. I'm not sure how many teams will actually be interested in adding him when he's pretty small, not particularly physical, not very good defensively, and in his one season ever in his career of making the playoffs, which was last year, he was a healthy scratch for the majority of the games. Despite being with the Oilers, who made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, Game 6 against the Panthers, he played just 5 playoff games throughout that campaign there for Edmonton. So that isn't really exactly a glowing recommendation. The Sharks will have to try and rehab his reputation a little bit, and to do so, they will need the offensive numbers to be so, exploding off of the page that a team cannot possibly say no and just wants the offensive help. And so to do that, it's not going to happen by playing with Wennberg and Gaudette on the third line. It has to be within that top 6. And so it seems as though the initial reaction at that point would be to have Jeff Skinner take the place of Colin Graf. It makes a ton of sense. As I've already mentioned, Graf is more so a player who is built for a kind of a third line role, most likely, and so place him with Wennberg and Gaudette and then have Skinner play on that second line with Smith and Toffoli. But another problem pops up because of that, which is that your second line will end up being really weak defensively. Smith, 20-year-old, not exactly bringing much of a two-way game. I already mentioned Jeff Skinner doesn't have much defense to him either, and then Tyler Toffoli would be the standout performer there, and even he is not particularly good defensively. So if that trio ever got caught in the defensive zone, there would be some very real issues for the Sharks. And so you might have to make a different substitution. Perhaps have Eklund end up playing with Smith and Toffoli, and then have Skinner up on the top line with Celebrini and Kurashev. But tell me if you've heard this before, that could also have a little bit of a problem here. Celebrini is the Sharks' best and most skilled player. You would likely want to try and surround him with other talented individuals, but the Sharks' second, third, and fourth best forward on this team are Eklund, Smith, and Toffoli, and they would all find themselves on the second line. Otherwise, Kurashev and Skinner, they can bring a certain level of talent, but they are a lot more hit or miss. Kurashev put up over 50 points 2 seasons ago, but this past year wasn't particularly good. And Jeff Skinner, as I said, being more of a one-dimensional guy, it's hard to really view him as that top-line player. So you would end up putting a lot of the burden and pressure onto Celebrini as this center to really drive this line and really elevate both of those players. And I'm not sure that is very fair to put onto a 19-year-old's plate. You'd want to have him likely play with someone like a Toffoli or an Eklund at the very least. And so there will have to be multiple iterations of what this top 6 and this this top 9 will end up looking like. Jeff Skinner isn't the most plug-and-play player that you could have possibly gotten, not particularly versatile, and so you kind of have to put him into a position where he could look to find success, but he does still bring offense to this group. That's what the Sharks needed, and so it's a pretty good signing in a vacuum here. The one last point that I do want to mention has to do with one of the Sharks' top prospects, if not their top prospect at this point, Michael Misa. A few days ago in that forward line video, I had mentioned that I wasn't expecting Misa to actually end up making his NHL debut, at least to start the year with the Sharks. I thought he would end up beginning the year in college hockey in the NCAA, but I wasn't very committing with that. I was kind of like maybe a 60-40 split at that point, where I thought it was more likely he'd be a college player, but it was certainly possible he'd still end up with the Sharks. However, with this Jeff Skinner signing that really rounds out this Sharks top 9 group, I imagine it is much more in favor of Misa heading to college to play that freshman year, probably like a 90-10 split at this point. Because as much as you say, okay, well, Misa has the chance to prove himself, it's difficult to do, because normally you'd say, okay, well, he can play in the preseason, see how he does, maybe get like a 9-game stint. But if he does that, he cannot end up playing in the NCAA this season. He would have to have a professional contract, and that excludes him from ever playing college hockey. At that point, his fallback would have to be heading back to the OHL to play with the Saginaw Spirit, and I don't think that is in his best interest. I don't think that's what the Sharks want him to do. They want him either to be in the NHL, of course, or have to go to college, where he can at least play kind of a semi-pro environment against slightly older players than him in the 20 to 24 range. And so it's kind of a tough position here for the Sharks. I'd love to see Misa be able to make his debut. It would be exciting to see him actually be in this NHL starting roster. If that were to happen, it would probably be someone like Graf or Kurashev ending up taking the spot on a fourth line, which would be pretty crazy, but definitely something that they could do. Or perhaps the Sharks trading away somebody within that top 9, but honestly, the only player who I could see that happening with is maybe Alex Wennberg, and then have Misa be the third line center. But Wennberg's $5 million contract is pretty useful towards staying above the salary cap floor, so even that I'm not sure if it will end up happening. So to me, it feels as though this Skinner signing has pretty much set the tone here for Misa, that okay, he's heading back to college, he'll play in the NCAA. It's not a bad decision. As I already mentioned, Celebrini, Smith, both of them played a year in college before making the jump to the NHL, and it seems to have benefited them. And so we'll end up seeing Misa closer to the end of this season, perhaps late March, early April, but that seems to be the direction that the Sharks are heading in. But otherwise, in a vacuum, this is a pretty good value signing for the San Jose Sharks. They don't really lose much of anything in doing so, and he could end up being a pretty good scorer for them. Class dismissed.